Ladies and gentlemen, representatives of the embassy, Nadia, thank you very much for coming today, and a special thanks to the organizers of the US-Ukraine Foundation and Save Ukraine Now, as well as the other sponsors that are here today who've been long friends of our great country. For the last year and a half, as you've heard, Ukraine has been facing a triple crisis. A military crisis because of the Russian invasion, the illegal annexation of Crimea, and the occupation of the eastern part of our country. A humanitarian crisis as a result of this disastrous war, and a very deep economic crisis. I am not a military expert, so I am thrilled that my colleague, Minister Prokhoda, shared with you the military aspect, and I will focus on the humanitarian and economic challenges that Ukraine faces today, what we have done, and what is needed to successfully overcome them. With regard to the humanitarian crisis, the war has brought incredible tragedy to the people of Ukraine. Approximately 8,000 people have died in the conflict. 18,000 people have been injured. Many of them, most of them, civilians. From Crimea, from Donbass alone, 1.5 million Ukrainians have fled their homes, have left their schools, have left their jobs, to come to the unoccupied, free Ukrainian territory, searching for safety, for shelter, for security. Over 70% of these internally displaced people are women and children. And when you think about the migrant crisis in Europe, please think about these 1.5 million internally displaced people in Ukraine. Today, Ukraine has the 8th highest number of such registered internally displaced people in the world. And it is at the same time one of the least funded international crises in the world. I want to pay special attention for a moment to the Tatar population, which has been subject to systematic discrimination, threats, abuse of human rights, selective justice. Tens of thousands of Tatars have had to leave their homes, the second forced exile of Tatars from their homeland in the Crimea by the Kremlin. Many of you have seen the recent news that the Crimean Tatars have started an economic blockade in Crimea to highlight this mistreatment at the hands of the occupiers. The United Nations estimates that 5 million Ukrainians are in need of humanitarian assistance. That's the population of Chicago and Houston combined. So one of our greatest problems is enabling governments and international organizations to gain access to the regions occupied by the Russian-sponsored terrorists and Russian forces. Civilians are in the most help there. And in these areas that have been severely restricted, we're faced not only with the recent Luhansk terrorist announcement that all UN organizations must leave and can no longer provide support through the Ukrainian territory, but moreover, with unexploded ordnance, with mines, with physical, not just political, problems. What have the Ukrainian authorities done? Most recently, we've set up along the corridor of the demarcation line Humanitarian Logistics Center, so that people who are stuck inside the occupied territories can have access to food, to mobile banking, without having to cross through all the different lines. But this is a humanitarian crisis of global perspective and requires a global attention. In parallel to this humanitarian drama, Ukraine is facing a serious economic crisis that's the result not of one, but of 4 successive catastrophes. First, 74 years of communism and dysfunctional planned economic governance. Second, 23 years of incomplete reforms, poor economic leadership, lack of rule of law. Third, during the last 5 years, we experienced a level of kleptocracy under the Yanukovych regime that has probably never been heard of or seen before in Ukraine, which at the same time amassed enormous sums of debt for which the country today must pay the price. And lastly, this devastating war. The crisis has seen the depreciation of our national currency, the hryvnia, which at some point lost up to 70% of its value. The central bank in March of this year had just 1 month's foreign currency reserves remaining and we were on the brink of a financial meltdown. All the while fighting a war to protect our freedom, our territorial sovereignty, and our European choice. So what has been our response to these twin crises? On the humanitarian front, we have tried our best to alleviate the worst consequences of the crisis for the people of Ukraine with the support of our international partners and humanitarian organizations. I know there's a dedicated session later today on this subject, so I won't go into a great level of detail, but give you 3 examples of what we are doing to support our people. Our pensioners, the largest categories of internally displaced people. There are some 1.3 million pensioners in the region, of which about 1 million have re-registered with the government in Kyiv to receive their pensions. They receive $83 million a month in total. And so since the beginning of this conflict, we have paid pensions to those citizens of over $1 billion. We've moved 9 universities and institutes out of the region to unoccupied free Ukraine so that students can re-register and continue their studies. We've established social centers to give medical aid for over 300,000 civilians, psychological counseling to 160,000 people. And we also help in the search of temporary dwellings. We provide financial assistance for accommodation, including for the disabled and the infirm. This displacement creates enormous unemployment problems. And although we are trying to provide support, you can imagine that in the midst of a very deep recession, where we already have 10% unemployment, it's very hard to relocate and very difficult to find jobs. But we continue to do this, spending some 6 billion on social expenses for the war-related casualties, for housing, for rehabilitation. It's obvious that there's a great deal to be done, but we are trying to do what we can within the means and resources that we have. The bottom line is that the stronger the Ukrainian economy is, the easier it will be for us to give an appropriate and effective answer to the humanitarian crisis. So our focus has been on winning the battle on the economic front, restoring macroeconomic stability. And we've engaged in what I think are a drastic set of very effective measures. First, we've reduced the expenses of the state. I've been responsible for very strict budgetary discipline, with one of the only priorities being our defense and law enforcement spending, which today is more than 5% of GDP. We've reduced our deficit, and we're continuing to reduce it year on year. Second, we've started to improve tax collection. We've gotten rid of many of the loopholes and increased revenues to the state. We've eliminated many of the prerogatives that both vested interests, or so-called oligarchs, have over the years enjoyed. And right now we're in the process of proposing a tax reform before the end of the year that will provide for more social justice, more clarity, simplification, more fairness, and a level playing field for both legal business and within the economy amongst different sectors. Third, the central bank has been extraordinarily effective in cleaning up the banking sector, reducing the systemic risks. We've had over 50 of the 180 banks, but those were the weakest banks, removed from the system. That's a very painful process, but the banks that remain are stronger. The banks that remain provide citizens with a greater sense of comfort that now when they put their deposits in, they won't be lost. Fourth, we've successfully negotiated a $17.5 billion extended fund facility program with the International Monetary Fund, the largest financial program per capita of the IMF in its history. Those are your taxpayer dollars too, you know. So we think. Fifth, we've really followed the benchmarks. We have fulfilled the covenants and the conditionalities of the IMF agreement, of the European Union macro-financial agreements, of the World Bank loans, of the United States credit guarantees. We have followed for over a year now all of the obligations and committed all of our commitments to the T. And that's an extraordinarily important thing because Ukraine over the 23 years of history often lost support because of its inability to follow through on its promises. That no longer characterizes our government, no longer characterizes our country. We have received 2 disbursements for a total of $6.7 billion already, and we are in the process of right now a review that would enable us to receive a 3rd tranche of an additional $1.7 billion. This money, for the most part, goes to the central bank reserves, which have now gone from under $5 billion to over $13 billion. That is an enormous marker of confidence, again, in the economy as a whole, but also in the banking system. And lastly, we managed to secure bilateral and international support from the United States, from Canada, from the European Union, from Germany, from Poland, from Japan, and several other countries, from the EBRD, from the EIB, all of these supporting the budget, supporting investment projects in Ukraine. And in particular, I want to thank the United States, and again, you as American taxpayers and American political leaders, for providing us with already two $1 billion loan guarantees, and hopefully a third in the very near future as you go through your budget process, as difficult as that may be. Seventh, we've successfully restructured our debt, and we have reached an agreement with a large group of our creditors, the ad hoc committee, on a 20% debt reduction, a 5-year period where we will not be paying principal, only interest. And this agreement meets the IMF objectives, so we stay in the program. It gives us a period of time within which, instead of paying $15 billion of principal, which would have really put an enormous drain on the economy if we were able to pay it at all, but instead the resources that we do have, we can put to good use in the country where we have enormous needs. It gives us a rest period. Thanks to these measures, what we're seeing already is that inflation, although still too high, is steadily dropping. Industrial output the decline has slowed. Most of the World Bank IMF forecasts show that we should be able to return to real economic growth in 2016 of some 2%. That means real wage growth, that means real job creation, that means real consumer purchasing power increase. Obviously, the economic crisis is not over yet. We still face a recession, but we have solved liquidity problems, solvency problems. The risk of that financial meltdown that we feared in March, that was very real, is over, and we built the foundations for a return to economic prosperity. As you can see, I'm optimistic for Ukraine in the medium and the long term, but in order to solve our short-term problems, we will continue to need more critical financial support, humanitarian aid from the international community, including the United States of America. But aside from financial aid, we also want to attract real investment, aside from loans, aside from aid. And for a moment, let me just say that international organizations have been very active in Ukraine. But the estimates of, for example, the UN, which are very conservative, show that we need some $300 million just to cover the needs of those internally displaced people. And the estimates that we've seen are that we have achieved about half of that from the international community, about 150 million. Within that is some $50-some million from the United States, helping with the internally displaced people, helping with the needs of the refugees. Recently, the German government built housing for some 4,600 displaced people, giving them a roof under which to live during the most cold season coming up. So we are very grateful. But the humanitarian crisis is exacerbated by our own degradation of our infrastructure. The infrastructure for transportation, for healthcare, for water treatment, for sanitation facilities, all have been badly damaged. And we have a shortage of medical supplies, medical facilities are in disrepair. A joint report by the World Bank, the United Nations, and the delegation of the European Union to the Ukraine conservatively estimated that the potential restoration of our infrastructure, aside from the basic needs of our internally displaced people, will cost us no less than $1.2 billion. And frankly speaking, that's without achieving full peace and restoration of our territorial integrity over the East. We will achieve that, given our military strength and our support from the international community. But when that happens, the needs will only grow. So I want to conclude my remarks by saying that none of the progress that we've achieved to date would be possible without the constant support of the United States. I want to thank you on behalf of the Ukrainian people with all my heart. But we do need greater assistance from the United States and the international community to tackle what I believe is the most important crisis on the European continent in this 21st century. I'm confident that with the unwavering support of the US, the American people who understand the Ukrainian desire for freedom, that Ukraine will continue on its path and achieve that prosperity that's so well deserved. Thank you.
The program today has been well over time. I'm going to try and stay a little bit here as we finish up this session. both ministers made a very impressive statement about the work Ukraine is doing to solve its three enormous crises. And support from the West and from the United States has been insufficient. And so we'll give them a chance to describe what they think they would most use from the United States. So, Mr. Poltorok, in order to help you fend off Russian aggression, specifically, what might you like, what would be helpful from the United States? As you know, I was part of a group that endorsed providing $1 billion a year for the next 3 years in military assistance to Ukraine, including advanced weaponry. What would help you stop Russian aggression in this tracks?
Дякую за запитання. Справа в тому, що ми вже працюємо давно. Ми неодноразово давали, що необхідно в списку, в тому числі, що необхідно українському війську для того, щоб захистити сьогодні країну. Але я розумію, що складна ситуація якось не склалася. Я хотів би відповідати за двома напрямками. Перше, це стосується нелетальної зброї. І тут я хотів би отримати допомогу в придбанні і передачі засобів розвідки, засобів радіоелектронної боротьби, засобів зв'язку, засобів закритого зв'язку. Це стосується оснащення військовослужбовців. Те, що стосується надання допомоги військово-промисловому комплексу України, тому що ми повністю відмовились від співпраці з Російською Федерацією. І тут проблема є, тому що практично всі технології і все озброєння воно було залежне від Російської Федерації. Сьогодні ми з ними не працюємо. Нам треба допомогти для того, щоб військово-промисловий комплекс запрацював. Це стосується технологій і допомоги в оснащенні. Те, що стосується літальної зброї, тут нам потрібна допомога в засобах протитанкової боротьби, в засобах ППО, в інших засобах, які забезпечують, ми хотіли би розширити цей список, які би забезпечили обороноздатність нашої країни. Ми сьогодні вже працюємо по великим напрямкам. Створений об'єднаний координаційний комітет разом з оборонним відомством Сполучених Штатів України, де є 14 підкомітетів, і вони практично розглядають всі питання, пов'язані з взаємодією. Але ми вчора розмовляли з своїм колегою, і я переконаний в тому, що ті комітети мають працювати більш ефективніше. На сьогодні вони працюють недостатньо, і ми виробили чітку програму і план, що ми маємо зробити для того, щоб покращити цю співпрацю. Дякую.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Ms. Minister, Larry Summers said 2 weeks ago that the West has a great strategic interest in Ukraine's success, and of course he's right. And that interest would justify today the United States and Europe together providing anywhere from $5 to $10 billion of grant aid to Ukraine. And perhaps if that does not help settle the crisis on the economic side, a great deal more later. This, he put it correctly, would be a great investment in the security of Europe and the West. What would you like to see from the West to help you deal with the many problems you face?
Well, thank you. The amount that was committed to Ukraine by our bilateral, multilateral partners over the past year was $7.5 billion. I would like to see that double next year. I think that the country has proven, number one, that it fulfills its commitments. Number two, I think it has proven that it maintains the political unity through the most difficult of times, through the most difficult reforms, such that it should be entrusted with even greater opportunity going forward. None of this comes without conditionality, so I don't have any problem with continued conditionality, but I think we now need to see that more than stabilizing the economy. Rebuilding the economy will require double the financial support in terms of financial. Of course, we'd like to see more humanitarian aid, immediate humanitarian aid, for the internally displaced people, for the terrorism that's been conducted on our territory. Third, from the United States and from the European Union, we'd like to see continued influence on the international financial institutions, whether it's the World Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the European Investment Bank. Those investment loans, those loans that help us to rebuild our infrastructure, are critical. They're very low cost, they're very long term. For example, 30 years, less than 1% interest. So they're critical for us to rebuild quickly. Fourth, we'd like the United States and the European Union to, of course, maintain sanctions fully until the Minsk agreement has been fully implemented. And if there is movement in the wrong direction, then sanctions should be increased. And finally, I would like to ask everyone to take a new look from an investment perspective, aside from aid, aside from credit, official credit, and take another look at the fact that 93% of our territory is free. 93% of our territory is open and ready for business. 93% of our territory will benefit January 1st from the full implementation of the European Union Deep and Comprehensive Free Trade Agreement, making Ukraine one of the most competitive platforms for export into the European Union in the world. With the human resource and talent and education, with the natural resources, with the geographic location, Ukraine is poised with these reforms, with the support of the international community, and with the ceasefire in place, to return to attracting major amounts of foreign direct investment. So those are my 5 asks.